Oh, Colin Mosquito is going to give us an opening prayer.
Our loving Father in heaven, we are grateful for this wonderful time to have this symposium with Dr. Zoller, and we're grateful for Brigham Young University and for the Political Science Department and the chance we have to learn from wonderful people all over. And we're grateful, Father, to be here at BYU. And we pray, help us to help our minds to always be inquisitive, to learn and to understand, and to take from Dr. Zoller good and wonderful knowledge. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Our speaker does have a microphone, but it's on his suit jacket, so I will shout as well. John Zoller is a professor of political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. He studies American politics, public opinion, and political parties. His first book, The Nature and Origins of Mass Opinion, published back in 1992, is considered, I think, fairly as a classic in political science. It's something that I think all of our faculty have read or are very familiar with. He's more recently returned to his roots in terms of studying parties and the party system. He's currently working on a book titled Beating Reform, the Resurgence of Parties in Presidential Nominations. And I'm sure we'll hear about work related to that today. He teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in American politics, public opinion, statistical methods, and other topics at UCLA. He's been on the board of overseers of the National Election Studies, as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Will you please join me in welcoming Professor John Zoller?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. The students, you students, have brought me here.
Did we turn the green, the other?
Oops.
Which one is which? I don't remember.
I don't know.
Oh, it's the other one.
I'm wired for success.
Okay, that'll do it.
Okay. Right, so that sounds a little better. I've been wanting to come to BYU for a long time, actually. One of my hobbies is collecting university campuses. And BYU is one of the ones I haven't been to. It's a beautiful campus you have. Richard Davis walked me around on it. I was full of envy at the mountains that you have as a backdrop. Quinn is going to take me up to the Y this afternoon, I hope, if it's not too muddy. I've also been able to get some research done on the nomination of Mia Love, who's the congresswoman from, I think from around here. Is she? Yeah, she's your congresswoman. So it's been a great trip for me, and I'm going to try to give you a great talk. I'm going to do my best. If it's not great, it'll at least, you'll see at the end, be big. This is going to be a talk about all of American politics and all of American history, American political history, the United States, not pre-American history. And in addition to all the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, it would be helpful to me if you guys would interrupt with questions or comments. If I don't get enough questions or comments, I will pick out people who are sitting right in front of me. In fact, you're going to be the first one, because yes, you introduced me and I met you at breakfast, and so be ready. So you choose or I choose what the first question is going to be. So the topic today is why Trump won, but it's going to be why Trump won in terms of his relationship to the American party system, and it's going to be not only why he won, but how he's governing. My general belief is that political parties are so important to democracy that, practically speaking, they are democracy in the United States. If somebody gets nominated by a party and wins a partisan election as a Democrat or a Republican, they're probably going to govern as a Democrat or a Republican, and that's what we're going to have for democracy. democracy. And public opinion as it matters, I believe, as it gets filtered through the party system. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all of that, public opinion filtering through the party system and so forth, but I will talk about the party system, starting at the very beginning and getting to Trump. Americans disagree, as you know, about whether Trump is great for America, but he's been super great for political science. There's no controversy about that. He's broken things that we thought we understood, and in other ways has been constrained in just the way we thought a politician would be constrained. So he's just a great subject for trying to understand the way the party system works. The party system. The way to think about parties, I believe, is that they are coalitions. In the United States, there are many, many different groups of people, but only two parties. And the reason for that is Dubourget's law, which I won't, that there are only two parties is Dubourget's law, but we just have many different groups and two parties. And the parties, sometimes you think the Democrats or the Republicans. There's no such thing as the Democrats or the Republicans. They try to act like they are a unified group, but they are a coalition. And especially on the Republican side right now, you're seeing the difficulties that a coalition is having holding itself together. But and it's a little bit unusual to be able to see the cracks in the coalitional structure, as we're now able to see in the Republican Party, but not that unusual. Normally, you don't see them. They look unified. You think the Republicans, they're all together, or the Democrats. But occasionally, like a depression in an economy, depressions are not normal, but they're not something to be surprised about when they happen, recessions or depressions. The Republicans are having a period of factional disagreement, which is kind of an exception in the long term of of the normal pattern, which is that both parties are kind of acting more like unified coalitions than the Republicans are acting right now. So I want to start off before there were parties, though, and with the framers of the Constitution, who, as you probably, I'm sure you know from your American history classes and your political science classes, the American founders hated parties. It's sometimes the Constitution that they created has been called a Constitution against parties, trying to make it difficult for parties to emerge. So they had the idea that, as I do, that a party is a coalition, that it involves groups uniting together behind one candidate, and that's what they wanted to not happen. Their ideal was that their ideal of democracy, which was that in each different part of the country, the leading citizens would be elected from the communities in which they lived and sent to Washington at the time, New York at the time, or Philadelphia. But they didn't want them to be chosen as members of parties. They wanted them to be chosen as virtuous individuals. And just to give you an example of what that might have looked like in my community, where I grew up in Los Angeles, it would have been Mike Martini that we would have sent. Mike Martini was a doctor. He saved my brother's life when he had nephrosis, but it wasn't that he was a doctor and took care of us all. He was just respected. And I recently was at actually the funeral of his wife, and I was talking to different people, and I was kind of testing this theory, like, who would we have sent? And everybody agreed it would have been Mike Martini. So I went and talked to Mike, and I said, Dr. Martini to me, and I said, Dr. Martini, I talk about you in all of my classes as the guy that we would send to national government. So I just wanted to make it real to you that there would be people, maybe I hope that some of you in some of your communities, know someone. This was my neighborhood. So like I tell to my UCLA students, it would have been John Wooden. That was our famous basketball coach. Just somebody who's very respected. And that was their ideal of democracy. And their idea was that if you could get all the best people into a room to decide, unencumbered by party, they would have no basis for making decisions except what was right. And so you just want to prevent factions, prevent parties. So their idea of preventing parties, they didn't want direct elections because they were afraid, and this is not a partisan comment against Donald Trump, but of someone who has done what Donald Trump has done, make himself famous in the media, win some elections without anybody knowing too much about him. That was exactly what they were afraid of. And it's, he might be a great president. I'm not saying he is or isn't, but I'm saying that method of selection was exactly what they were afraid of. And the method of preventing that method of selection was the Electoral College, so that people were not supposed to vote for president. They were supposed to send Mike Martini to the Electoral College, and all the Mike Martinis of America would pick the best person to be the president, and similar choice of Congress, for Congress and for all institutions. And that's an attractive ideal of democracy. I think a lot of people wish that we could have that. But it didn't work. It didn't work for even 5 minutes. As the framers were leaving the Constitution Hall, they were saying, okay, who is it for vice president? It was obviously going to be Washington for president, but like, who should we pick for vice president? And they were talking, and they decided it should be Adams. It shouldn't be. I forget. Somebody was like, not him, Adams, and it was Adams. So they naturally did what everybody else naturally does. They tried to form coalitions among the people that they thought were the good people like themselves, to get a good person in. That's what both parties are: coalitions of people who agree with each other and regard one another in their party as good people, and want to get their person in instead of the other person who would not be a good citizen. So that was the idea of the founders. It was a noble idea. It came apart. The Constitutional Convention itself was a party happening, in my view. It was a coalition of the Southern planters and the Northern mercantilists, leaving out working people, working men. There were working men that they didn't think were responsible and shouldn't participate. There were Western frontiersmen that they didn't think highly of, and of course slaves were not included. So it was a party. It was a coalition of different kinds of people. And when the party system came apart, it was between the Southern planters and the Southern planters dissented from Hamilton's economic plans, because they were good for the North and they weren't good for the South. And so the Jeffersonians began organizing with working men. I want to call them, that's what they were called at the time, working men. It was probably mostly men. And frontiersmen, and they formed a coalition which became the Jeffersonian Republicans. And they newspapers were just coming on strong. They were as new then as the internet was maybe 10 years ago. I mean, there had always been newspapers, but there got to be a lot of newspapers, and it made a difference. And so the country was able to coordinate into an anti-federalist party across the whole country with newspapers. And so they talked in the newspapers about who the candidates should be locally and nationally, and there would be discussions in the newspapers, like there are discussions in the internet today, people of like mind getting together, saying who it should be, and that's how they nominated people in the first party system. So the parties formed. So the Federalist Party, which was the Framers' Party, and then the Anti-Party, which was the Jeffersonian Party. And I'm not going to talk about it. The Jeffersonians just dominated. They just blew away the Federalists. Never won another election after Jefferson's became president in 1800. And we had no parties for just a short time. But then the parties got going again, and they began nominating presidents in these national party conventions. And each party would bring together the leaders from all around the country. And they tended to be fishermen from Maine, bankers from Philadelphia, Southern planters from the South, saloon owners from the Mississippi River area. Well, not saloon. I wanted to mention something bigger than like farmers from the interior areas. That is to say, people who were members of different groups. So the parties, different kinds of people were coming together in these coalitions, into these party conventions, and choosing their national party nominees. So now I'm focusing on president. And these conventions were, well, they eventually became very much like what you have here in Utah. You nominate still mostly through conventions. So people from all around the state, but it was people from all around the country, and so much more diverse because it was a big country. Fishermen from Maine, Southern planters, and these people would come together and they would all have their first choice idea for president. But that person usually couldn't win. It was usually a second choice who was acceptable to a lot of different people. And that was a feature of our party system from 1828, when these first party conventions started to happen, through 1968. Both parties were collections of people from all around the country having different views, and they tended to nominate second best people, everybody's second choice, or everybody's somebody who was acceptable to everyone. And although that wasn't what the framers had in mind, that a party could work that way, it was, I think, a good way to work. You had leaders from all of the different kinds of people, groups, social groups, economic groups, religious groups, coming together and finding somebody who was acceptable to all of them. Usually also they knew that person. It was somebody who had been active in the political system and had a record. The voters didn't necessarily know about this. In fact, the earliest conventions, they were outside the law. They were just informal groups of people, Democratic club, Republican club, or Whig club, as back then, would just get together and they would nominate somebody, and then voters developed attachments to the two parties. So voters were voting for either the Whigs or the Democrats, or later the Democrats or the Republicans. And that was the party system. And these same kinds of people who were present at these national conventions were also active locally and would nominate the people for Congress. And maybe the fishermen from Maine, when they nominated someone for Congress from their area, wouldn't be thinking about Southern planters, but because they knew they were in a party with Southern planters and that the National Party was going to have to get along with Southern planters and farmers and all these different people, usually the people that the local fishermen in Maine would send up as under the, say, Democratic label would be someone who knew that he had to cooperate with these other groups and would have a platform that he would accept the main ideas of all these other groups. So there were these platforms that represented the collection of all of the demands of all of the different groups. And everybody all around the country, when they were nominated to be a Democrat or a Republican, knew that they had to accept the general principles of these two parties. The principles were very general, as necessary to encompass very broad coalitions. And that's how the party system functioned until 1968. In 1968, I need a question. What's your question?
So, how does this like Trump?
I'm sorry, what?
So we've had all of this evolution of kind of this party system, and how have we gotten to what we have today?
That is exactly what I am transitioning on to, but you don't you have a backward-looking question about this? Forward-looking, that's where I'm headed. Okay, so Trump, I will say this, Trump could never have been nominated from this system. That's not, again, a statement about him. But I mean, I'm not saying good or bad. Maybe this is bad and he should have been nominated by this old system, but it wouldn't have picked somebody who was as far outside, who had not been active in politics and who did not have an established relationship with one of the major partisan groups. So in 1968, they made, and 68 to 7, through the early 70s, they did some reforms that made it possible for somebody like Trump, who was an outsider, not representing a traditional position within either of the parties, to win. And what they did was they went to the system that we have now, which in most states are primaries, these wide open primaries. You tend not to have them as much here in Utah, but you've been reading about New Hampshire and all, you read about the presidential nominating system. They have these elections where all the Democrats run against one another and they get delegates, they win delegates in their state primaries. Whoever gets the most delegates in the state primaries, they can send them to the national convention. Whoever has the most delegates in the national convention gets the nomination. The group leaders, the union leaders, the business leaders who used to be in command of the old style convention were cut out of it. It was all voters. The voters picked the delegates who picked the president, the presidential nominee. And that was a fundamentally different system. They still do have these conventions that they've always had throughout American history, but the difference is, and it's a big, big difference, in the old system, the leaders of these different groups would come to the conventions uncommitted. They were primarily responsible to came out of their local organizations, and they came there to see if they could find a common denominator for president. Now, the delegates come, they are picked in the primaries by the voters, and they are legally committed to the candidate. So there's no bargaining among these people at the national convention. Whichever candidate won the most votes in the primaries, that's who it's going to be. And he's not everybody's second choice, it's whoever won the most delegates. So the action is now with the voters. It's a small d democratizing reform that made it possible for Trump to win. Yes?
Is that why we ended up with so many candidates?
There have been a lot of candidates in the past, but they tended to whittle them down pretty quickly. And the main point is that you needed to have an organized part of the party in favor of you, and you needed to be acceptable to a broad number of people. Those were the things that needed to be present up until 1968, but are not present. today. And so you saw, to look ahead to Trump, you saw members of his own party, including Mitt Romney, criticizing the candidate of their own party. You guys are young enough, you might not know this. That has never happened before. Well, maybe 1912 was the last time it happened, when Theodore Roosevelt and Howard Taft split and the Republican Party split. But it is not common for maybe 20%, I think it was on the Republican side, of the office holders and respected leaders of the party to make critical comments against their nominee and sometimes even say that they're not supporting him. That's a very costly thing to do. You're trying to ruin the election for the whole party. People get mad at you for that. But that was what happened because he was selected by voters rather than by party insiders. So you might think that that's good. The party insiders shouldn't control things. If you do, you would be disagreeing with, I would say, the modern version of the Republican parties. If Madison had been, of the founders, if Madison were around today, he would have liked the old system because it would have forced people to form a coalition on the basis of something other than a narrow interest. So that's where Trump came from. He came from the reformed system in which all of the voters, in which the voters were king. So yes, a question. Thank you.
So you said the transition would be from provincial interests to like two broad coalitions that are very divided against each other, as opposed to a bunch of like two coalitions being a collection of like narrow interests that are local?
I would say that the coalitions have always been more or less local and narrow. But there was this national convention that forced them to find somebody agreeable to all of them. That was the dynamic, acceptable to all of them. What can happen in these primaries is these sequential primaries, somebody does a little bit better than expected and they get some momentum and some publicity and the person becomes the man or woman of the hour, and pretty soon somebody who has 25% is getting all this publicity and they're winning enough delegates so that everybody sees that, oh, nobody's going to be able to beat them, and they get on the bandwagon just because they're winning. And so you can get narrow factional winners out of this system. The dynamics of the primary, of media-driven momentum, can create a narrow factional winner based on voters voting in a way that did not happen under the old system. Another question? I don't see it. Yes?
What system did it use, like 1968 and more?
Inappropriate reverence for democracy. The elites at the time, so that's a snide way of putting it. I'll explain it to you. But I do feel that way. I feel that democracy has gotten just a little out of hand. I'm great for democracy between the parties. Within the parties, you want well-chosen candidates so that whichever side wins, you're going to have a responsible winner. And the way the party system worked before was always going to be acceptable. Both sides were always going to be acceptable to a fairly broad group. And they're also going to be experienced and vetted. And so that's what's gone away. But okay, so what happened in 1968 was the Vietnam War was going on. The Democratic Party was the majority party. Lyndon Johnson was the president. And there were some primaries, but they were called beauty contest primaries. So the candidates would run in the primary, but they didn't have any meaning. And most of them didn't have any political significance. The voters would vote, and the delegates to the convention would be the same old people doing whatever they wanted. So it's 1968. The anti-war movement was very strong in the Democratic Party at that time, and there's Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy running as anti-war candidates, and they ran in all of the primaries. They won in every primary that they entered, which there weren't as many as now. And then Hubert Humphrey, who was the establishment candidate, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, won without entering a single primary. He wouldn't even go to a state where there was a primary where somebody might ask him a question. He completely stiffed the voters, and he got the nomination. And it was considered an outrage. And in order to unify his party behind his candidacy as he was going into that election, he says, oh, well, I'll appoint a reform commission, and it will change the rules to make the primary stronger. And so they instituted the new system at that time. And it was done it had to be done at the state, there was a reform commission. But the main rule was that the delegates had to be selected in the primaries and bound to the candidates. The bound to the candidates was a little bit more iffy, but they had to be selected in the primaries and by the candidates themselves. And so that destroyed the old system. So I say a misplaced democratic idea. They thought that it would, the democracy would be good. Why not? It almost almost caused trouble. George Wallace, if you know George Wallace, he was the Southern governor who stood in the schoolhouse door literally to block segregation with the famous phrase, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That guy almost came close to winning the Democratic nomination through the primaries in 1972. Who did win was George McGovern, the farthest left candidate that we've had. It immediately misfired. And there's a story about how the elites kind of, for a while, got control of it again. But lately, it's just a wide open contest in which anybody can win, and in which the elites have lost control. So that's the party system. But another question, so I wanted to, so I have more questions. Yes? I disagree with that. I think they're coalitions of groups.
Yeah, okay. So, if that's the case, how does that contribute to the party different in formally party or almost party?
I don't know whether polarization is more or less in the United States than in Europe. And I don't have a story for why polarization has developed in the United States over this time. The only thing I can say about it is that it is not extremely unusual to have intense dislike across the partisan camps. And three periods in American history, just from reading the history, I get the sense that it was as intensely polarized, with this strong negative affect against one another, in three other periods. One was the 1790s, when they were first getting parties going. The other was the 1850s, followed by a civil war, but they hated each other pretty bad, and it sounded actually worse than now. Let's see. And then the late 19th century, when the party system reemerged from the Civil War and got strong, we don't have public opinion polls from that time, but there was a lot of partisan hatred and a lot of, like in the legislature, measured, all the Democrats against all the Republicans and freezing the other party out of power. All of that was totally present in the late 1890s under the old system. And probably a lot of dislike too, if you could have measured it. We tend to anchor off the 1950s as normal. The 1950s were not normal. They were more like a hiatus in the normal operation of the party system, in a lot of ways and for reasons I'm not sure about. But okay, you can continue. If you see hands that I don't see, you can be my designated person since I'm not seeing the hands. Okay, one more question. Oh no, here, yes.
You said that the 1968 reform put the power back in the hands of the people.
Not back, it put it into.
Put it into the hands of the people. What's another example in just the history of the world where something like that happened and it created a situation where something possibly?
We are, the United States, I'm not a comparativist, I'm a narrow Americanist, but we are at almost only, or maybe the only big, serious, real country that handles nominations this way. The British Labour Party has moved to democratize their system a little bit more, but I believe that we're an outlier among the advanced nations, on the forefront of democracy, which I don't feel good about saying that we're going too far with democracy. So we're on the forefront of democracy, for better or for worse. And I think we're going to stay there, because I don't think you're putting the genie back in the bottle. And I don't think the world is going to end either. We'll have to figure it out. I think we're going through a rough patch. Yes. Yeah. And then I need to get going. No, sorry. Thank you. Go ahead. There was much more cross-party cooperation in Congress at that time, and the parties didn't attack each other as viciously, and there were moderates in both parties in a way that there aren't today. But it was a kind of a fake moderation in the following sense. It was mostly driven by the Southern Republicans, Southern Democratic Republicans, who were conservative, racist, standing up for segregation, but in the Democratic Party. So they were neither liberal nor, they tended to be economically liberal. They wanted New Deal programs for their people, but they were racially conservative. So they would go back and forth between the parties. And that made it look like Democrats and Republicans were cooperating, and they were more than now. But a lot of it was driven by this feature that an important group, I would say, Southern whites, was not really fitting well within either party system, and were shortly expelled from the party system. It was an interesting thing. An important group, Southern white racists, lost representation in the party system in the 1960s, and kind of floated around for a while. But so there were reasons for it. And the groups within the party coalitions were not getting along that well at that time also, on the Democratic side. Okay, so Trump gets the nomination. Then, now he's the Republican nominee. And another feature of our party system is this thing called party identification, which is a tendency for people to think of themselves as Democrats or Republicans. So there's this standard question which is asked in American on surveys. Generally speaking, do you consider yourself a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or what? Do you consider yourself a Democrat? Well, that is a weird question. Like, do you consider, it's like, do you identify with this group? It seems like a normal question, but I think it's an odd question to have so many people willing to say, yeah, I'm a Democrat. And not only that, they tend to be unself-conscious about it, to inherit it often from their parents. When I was a graduate student, I had read The American Voter. They had this question in it. My sister came to visit me, and I said, I'm going to ask my sister this question from this book that I just read that I think is really neat. I said, hey, Paula, generally speaking, do you consider yourself a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or what? And she looked at me like I was totally crazy, and she says, John, you know that Mom and Dad are Democrats, don't you? And they were Catholic Democrats, too. It would be as if I had asked, well, I assume most of you are Mormons. You know, if you had asked your brother, like, generally speaking, do you consider yourself a Mormon, a Catholic, a Jew, or a Protestant? Like, what? That was how my sister reacted. And that's at the basis of the party system. And then as people process communication, these are voters now, they believe things that are said about their group, their party group, and about the opposition group. And then for reasons that I don't have an explanation, I can't explain, but this communication has gotten very negative, and the parties hate each other. Members of the two parties hate each other, at least as measured in surveys, more so than at any time in the survey age. People would rather have you like marry, I don't know, a Russian spy than a member of the other party. I mean, like Santa Claus has become partisan, giving away things. But people will discriminate against members of the opposite party more than they will discriminate against African Americans or members of other religious groups. The partisanship is intense. So when Donald Trump was not the majority, anything like a consensus choice within the Republican Party, but once he became the party nominee, the psychological attachment to parties kicked in, and all kinds of Republicans who would never have picked him started liking him and already hated Hillary. And all of the Democrats, they didn't like Hillary much better than many Republicans liked Trump, but they hated the Republican, whoever it was. And so Trump inherited a huge partisan base. 85 to 90% of the people who voted for Mitt Romney voted for Donald Trump, and same Obama to Clinton. Most people vote for the same party all the time. I'll tell you, in my life, I have voted for Republicans twice when I was young, and one of them was a mistake. And the other was a good vote. But, and I think a lot of people are that way, especially you'll see as you get older. You'll get attached to the parties and it'll just seem like this is the one, and you won't pay a lot of attention, but you'll hear a lot of stuff that you good about your party, and you'll think, oh yeah, all right, okay. And then the other party, you believe that too, and it'll be very easy for you to be a comfortable partisan. Not everybody is that way. It's hard to say exactly how many are that way. Probably 75, 80% are reliably like I just described myself. So why do we have swings in elections? So I have a handout for you now. And so you have that handout. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that handout. So this is an x-axis across the bottom here, and it shows how the election, how the economy is doing in the election year, and this is the vote margin for the incumbent. So let me just I'm going to take LBJ up there. So that was 1964. LBJ, 1964, the economy, the real disposable income, economic growth in that year made the average person 5.5 percentage points better off. So now they talk more about GDP than RDI, but RDI is real disposable income. It's a number very much like GDP, gross domestic product. So, GDP is like 2 or 3% usually, and RDI is usually about there, but it was 5.5% there. So that was a great year. An unusually good year. And he's the incumbent party, and he got his vote margin, the amount by which he beat his opponent, was 20-something percentage points. You should all be able to see that on your graph in front of you. And then here's Jimmy Carter down here. It was actually negative in 1980 when he was running, and he lost to Ronald Reagan by 10 percentage points. So these are vote margins. They're not Democrat-Republican votes. They're the incumbent vote minus the challenger vote. And all of these names on here are the names of the incumbent party candidate. So this one right here, McCain, is McCain-Obama. But it's called McCain because the Republicans were the incumbent party in 2008. And so the economy was having a weak year in 2008, and Obama won by 7.5. The vote margin was 7.5 percentage points, according to that graph. And then here's Obama, this is Obama 2012. It's now labeled for him because he's the incumbent in 2012, and it's incumbent vote margin over there. The economy was better, and he did better. So this is not a perfect relationship, but it's a strong relationship. And yet the trend line is kind of like going through the middle of the data. And so as you go from like 0 to 6 on the economy, you go from -10 to +20, so about 30 points. So it looks like you get about 5 points of vote share for every 1 point of RDI. Yes? Eisenhower.
Okay. So is this relationship suggesting that the American public perceives that the president has significant impact on our economic development?
I don't know what they perceive, but this is what they do.
It's a fascinating correlation.
If you would ask the people, partisans like me, like the economy is always getting better when there's a Democrat in Congress. In fact, if people are asked, there's this neat graph that shows how is the economy doing, and it's like the Democrats are way up here, the Republicans are way down here, and then it gets to be January 20th, 2016, they flip. But those are the partisans. There's a substantial number of people who are not being partisan, who are voting for the parties, but in a nonpartisan way based on the performance of the economy. There's one other factor that's of importance here. I have the darker circles are cases where a party is seeking its first reelection. And these are cases, so this is Clinton in 96. So his party has controlled the White House only one term. It's 1996. So, and here's Eisenhower is 56, Nixon 72. These are all parties seeking their first reelection. These are all parties seeking their second or third reelection. So this is McCain in 2006 seeking the third term or a second reelection. This is Stevenson. It was going to be in 52 was going to be the fifth term for the Democrats. And you notice that these people who are seeking that extra, going beyond the first reelection are systematically on the low side. It's like after 2 terms, the voters, there's a tendency to want to throw the bums out. And then these, and giving an advantage to people seeking their first reelection. So going into 2016, Hillary was in some trouble because the economy was down right here. That's the economy in 2016. So she's in negative territory, right? You expect her to lose by 5 percentage points in a generic Democrat versus a generic Republican. And she's going for a second reelection. She's got that other factor going against her too. So by the political fundamentals of the situation, she's under serious disadvantage. Now, candidate-specific traits matter too. So where does she come out? There she is, right there. She overperformed her fundamentals. If you take into account that it was her second reelection, that's where she should have been, taking into account both of those factors, not just the economy. That's where she came out, a narrow, a two point, this is the popular vote, not the electoral college vote. So she overperformed the fundamentals on the popular vote by quite a lot, but not enough to win the election, not enough to win the electoral college. But so the point, where did Trump come from? He had to overcome, he had to do just well enough to beat the fundamentals that Hillary had going against her, and he did. He was, in terms of the relative strength of the two candidates, she overperformed her fundamentals, he underperformed his. But he underperformed his by a small enough margin that he was able to get elected anyway. So the party system, the way that the party system worked in this election, I would say was typical. Now, she way overperformed it, but a lot of people have overperformed by about that amount. She overperformed by a kind of a normal amount, and a high normal amount. She was a kind of a high normal candidate, and Trump, who's the inverse of that, was a low normal candidate. Which isn't to say that she was good and he was bad. It might have been that she was bad and he was worse. But she had a candidate-specific advantage that enabled her to outperform the fundamentals. But Trump was advantaged by the fundamentals, and I would say even though he underperformed them, I mean, if it had been an average economy and Hillary had overperformed by that amount, she would have been president. So I would say that he profited by the fundamentals. He underperformed them, but not by that much. And he won the election by I would say, the normal operation of the party system here. Where did Trump come from? He won the nomination by doing better than expected and getting some momentum and capturing the Republican nomination, where Republican and Democratic juices then kick in, and like 90% of the people are voting for who they always vote for, and then the rest of the fundamentals were what put him over the top, even though he underperformed them.
So are you saying that another Republican candidate would have had probably a better, if not the same chance of beating Hillary Clinton?
I would say that probably so, and that also any other I think that Hillary was not a strong candidate. I think she was weak. Tim Kaine, her vice president, I think could have won by a lot more. But I don't want to say, like some of the Republican challengers might there were definitely Republicans who could have done better than that, yes. In fact, I would say almost any of them. I mean, when you think of it's not funny. He had some, it's funny. That Access Hollywood thing that happened to him. I mean, there's just never been anything like that. And I don't think it would have happened to any of the other Republicans. And take away Access Hollywood, and I just think that had to hurt him a lot. So yeah, I think, and in the old system, they would have nominated, it might have been a generic, colorless Bob Dole, or Mitt Romney, just kind of generically boring, but no worries. That's what you would have gotten out of the system on both sides, and then the points would have been closer to the line. Yes. It's definitely the case that she underperformed and overperformed in particular states. So we're not modeling the state vote here, we're modeling the national state. People do model the state-by-state vote, and you can read about it, but it's not as easy to see what's going on. Yeah, there's a lot of state-by-state variation. That's systematic. Like most importantly, Michigan. The northern counties of Michigan didn't vote how they usually vote, and it happened to be a close election in Michigan, and et cetera. So there's a lot more going on. But I don't think it contradicts. It more like fills in the big story. So then Trump becomes president. And he is at the head of a coalition of Republicans who have been nominated, like I said earlier, by Republicans locally. And so there's a whole bunch of people, although he's an unorthodox Republican, he's got to deal with a Congress which is the regular Republican coalition. And so how is that going to work? Before I say that, I want to say one other thing about Trump and how he got nominated. So parties are coalitions, and coalitions don't necessarily represent every group. They don't represent groups unless they're organized and can play in the nomination game. And Trump organized a group of Republicans in the Republican Party who felt left out, who had anti-establishment feelings, and who were right to have anti-establishment and have some anti-establishment resentment, in the sense that the Republican Party, as it functioned through most of the late 20th and early 20th century, was a business party. So local Republican business, like the I'm not knocking it. It's like that was that group and that party. The unions are equally big in the Democratic Party, and some people resent that. But on the Republican side, it was a business party, and not everybody in the Republican Party is enamored of business. And this was in my current research, going around talking to voters and talking to leaders who later became Trump leaders. There's a lot of resentment in the Republican coalition, a feeling that they weren't being represented by the party as it functioned. People with anti-immigrant views. So anti-immigrant is maybe the biggest left-out coalition in the Republican Party until recently. The business leaders of the Republican Party are pro-immigrant. That's the labor force. Especially in agriculture, but also in many industrial sectors, they are pro-immigrant. The high-tech sectors, they all want immigrants. But there's a lot of whites in the Republican Party who don't want immigrants. And they weren't getting representation. And they weren't going to get representation under that old system. So the small d democraticness of it was their friend. It enabled them to elect somebody through the primaries that they couldn't have elected through the regular nominating system, the old nominating system. So that's an interesting point. They were a group that was underrepresented in their party. Let me just go a little further, because I'm running out of time, and I'd like to just say a little bit about how Trump has governed. And he's had a lot of trouble getting his stuff passed. And when he has been able to get it passed, it's been mostly just the tax cut, and it was not his tax cut, it was Paul Ryan's tax cut. Paul Ryan, leader of the Republicans in the House, wrote that tax bill. He's had to do what the Republicans in the House do, and that's traditional Republican things. So he's had a lot of trouble doing things. Most of what he's been able to do has been by executive order. Some of his executive orders on immigration, and most recently on trade. He's announced that he's going to unilaterally impose trade barriers. Those are things he doesn't need Congress for. He's not been able to get very much out of Congress. Congress is gridlocked. Am I supposed to stop talking now? What's the time? Well, I'll just leave it. I'll just leave it there. That he's had to deal with the regular Republican Party, and a regular Republican Party that is not unified. It's been having it's rent by faction, and so it's been difficult for the Republican Party to do anything on its own. It would have needed a leader of its own coloration, and it hasn't had one. And so, as the candidate of an outsider group, he's had trouble leading a traditional Republican coalition in the Congress. And that's the reason, excuse me, that's the reason why he's had trouble passing things. I want to say it's not only because he's an outsider. The Republican Party has internal problems that are a little bit unusual anyway, but the combination of those things has made it very difficult for the Republican Party to function as a party under the leadership of a non-conventional candidate. So, there you go.